Tonight we are talking about Stonehenge and the Holy Grail. Graham Phillips has never been afraid of controversy, and in 1995 he made headlines around the world and created a storm in the Vatican that even involved the Pope himself when he discovered a lost artifact that may have been the original Holy Grail.
Well, the story of the Holy Grail that most people know is that it was supposed to be the cup used by Jesus at the Last Supper. And when he was executed, one of his followers, Joseph of Arimathea, used this same cup to collect a few drops of Jesus' blood while he was on the cross. That imbued the cup with miraculous healing properties. And when Joseph of Arimathea fled from Roman persecutions of the Christians from Palestine, he came to Britain, which was outside of the Roman Empire at that point, but still in close contact trading-wise with the Roman Empire. He came to Britain and founded a church. And then he died, the Grail was hidden. And then, according to legend, centuries later, King Arthur becomes ill and he is dying, and his knights are sent on a quest.
My Alien Life is recorded live from atop the Northern Rocky Mountains and is available on Spotify, Stitcher, iTunes, and everywhere fine podcasts are found. My website is at www.myalienlifepodcast.com. There you will find my email address, all previously recorded shows, and more. I am Cameron Brower. This is My Alien Life, and the podcast starts right now.
My Alien Life Podcast.
Three, two, 1, 0, and liftoff.
My guest tonight is author Graham Phillips, who's been described as a historical detective, a modern-day adventurer, and a real-life Indiana Jones. He has been one of Britain's best-selling nonfiction authors for over 30 years. In the 1980s, after working as a radio journalist and a broadcaster for the BBC, he turned his talents to investigating unsolved historical mysteries. He has since written 16 books that are available around the world. Graham Phillips, thank you so much for joining me, and welcome.
It's my pleasure to be on. Thank you very much indeed for inviting me.
You've written an incredible collection of books, and it doesn't matter who you are, you could definitely find an interesting read. So how much work goes into one of these historical pieces, and what is your approach, and how is that different from other works on the historical stacks, say, in our libraries?
Well, I suppose it's difficult to say how much each book actually takes to write, because I tend to be working on a number of things simultaneously, and some of my research into some historical mysteries just gets nowhere. So I might have spent a year working on something that turns out to be a complete dead end. So some things on and off, like I've researched the King Arthur legend on and off for years. The book about Stonehenge that I've just written and the other stone circles, again, that's something I've been researching on and off, but the physical process of actually writing it, I suppose, takes about a year. But the way that I approach what I'm doing, different to others, is that I'm not an archaeologist, I'm not a historian. My background, as you mentioned, is in journalism, but I tend to feel that a lot of the answers to certain historical mysteries, like, for example, why was Stonehenge built? Was there a real King Arthur? Did the Holy Grail exist? That the answers are there that historians have already researched, found out about, part of the overall puzzle. Archaeologists have discovered a bit more. People who have studied mythology and medieval legends might know a little bit more of it, but they never get to talk to each other. They're in completely separate disciplines. So I try and take an overall view and believe that the pieces of the puzzle are there, and I just assemble them to hopefully come up with some kind of answer.
I think it's interesting to me that you had mentioned just now that on some of your research, you hit a dead end and you can't go on. And I know that's got to be really disappointing when you write a book. And I read a book a few years ago. It was called On Writing, and it was written by Stephen King. And one of the quotes in there, it says, "Don't be afraid to kill your babies." And I know it's hard once you invested all that time into writing, and then you just have to give in or give up because there's nothing left. So what's that like?
It's pretty disappointing, but but what I do find, which is quite rewarding, is that sometimes I'll completely hit a dead end, come back to that same thing a few years later when there's more archaeological work being done on that particular subject, and find that I can continue. So it's not always completely finished, but I agree with what you said. Stephen King said, you really, if you're going nowhere with something, you've got to be prepared to stop and move on to something else.
So which one of your works have been your favorite? Which has been the most enjoyable, and maybe which one it turned out exactly the way you wanted it to?
This one, actually, the one I've just had published, Wisdom Keepers of Stonehenge, that's the one that I've been working on and off on for perhaps 20 years, maybe longer than that. And it's only in recent years that the archaeological dating has been accurate enough to really kind of put an overall perspective on the ancient stone circles and other megalithic monuments of the British Isles. And so, yeah, it's this one. I've been interested in Stonehenge all my life. And when I first went there when I was a kid, you could just walk up, and you could walk up to it, and you could go and sleep in the middle of it if you wanted to, camp out. But obviously now, because over the years people have been chipping bits off to take home as souvenirs, you can't actually go up to the stones in the house. You can get pretty close, you can get good photographs, but you can't go and sleep there at night anymore. It's a properly protected monument. So no, I would say this one.
I want to talk about Stonehenge, but first I would really love to hear about the Hawkstone Grail. You gained international notoriety for finding this ancient religious piece. So tell us of what the Hawkstone Grail is for those of us who haven't read about it or have kind of it was in the news a lot, and it's very interesting. And so what is the Grail, and where has it been for the last 2,000 years?
Well, the story of the Holy Grail that most people know is that it was supposed to be the cup used by Jesus at the Last Supper. And when he was executed, one of his followers, Joseph of Arimathea, used this same cup to collect a few drops of Jesus' blood while he was on the cross. That imbued the cup with miraculous healing properties. And when Joseph of Arimathea fled from Roman persecutions of the Christians from Palestine, he came to Britain, which was outside of the Roman Empire at that point, but still in close contact trading-wise with the Roman Empire. He came to Britain and founded a church. And then he died, the Grail was hidden. And then, according to legend, centuries later, King Arthur becomes ill and he is dying, and his knights are sent on a quest to discover this Grail. It's the only thing that he could drink from to cure him of his impediment. And the knights go in search of the Grail, and they eventually find it. Now, that's the story that most people know, but that isn't the original Grail story. The original Grail story was that it's similar, but slightly different in as much as it doesn't involve a man, it involves a woman. The story is that Mary Magdalene, one of Jesus's followers, went to she was the first person to see the risen Jesus when he rose from the tomb. And she went to the tomb to anoint his body with precious perfume, as was the Jewish tradition. But when she got to the tomb, she saw the risen Christ and used this perfume jar to collect a few drops of his blood from the wounds in his hands. Now, you've got pretty much the same thing happening afterwards. This scent jar that Mary Magdalene has then becomes imbued with astonishing healing powers. Mary Magdalene then takes the cup out of Jerusalem when the persecution of the Christians starts. She eventually ends up in Britain, and the cup is hidden and then later sought by King Arthur and his knights. Now, so when I first discovered that there were actually two Grail legends, the Mary Magdalene one first, and then in the Middle Ages, people became more interested in the story of Joseph of Arimathea. The church during the Middle Ages was even debating that women had souls. So you didn't really want to start promoting a heroine having the power to hold the Grail. So the Mary Magdalene story kind of vanished out and the Joseph of Arimathea story carried on. So I wanted to try and find where that story was mainly set in Britain. In all the early Arthurian stories, it is said that the Grail was kept in somewhere called the White Castle in the White Town. And astonishingly, there actually is a place called the White Town in Britain. It's actually called Whittington now, from the old word Whittington, White Town. And in it, there is a castle known as the White Castle because it was built from light-colored limestone. Now, what's astonishing is around about the year 1200, when the first Grail stories were being written, and they referred to Mary Magdalene's scent jar, the people who lived at Whittington Castle, called the Fitzwarine family, actually claimed to have possessed this item. So if all the early stories of the Grail are saying that the Grail is hidden in the White Castle in the White Town, it seemed to me that the place that the physical geographical location that they had in mind when they were writing this was this castle where there lived some people who actually claimed that they possessed the cup of Mary Magdalene. But over the years, when the story all got mixed up with Joseph of Arimathea, that was forgotten about. So I thought, well, if that's the original cup that started the legend, whether or not these people really did possess a cup that Mary Magdalene had, it certainly was something that started the story going. So what I found absolutely astonishing is that the direct descendant of the Fitzwarine family from the White Castle in Whittington, in the mid-1800s, one of their direct descendants, a historian called Thomas Wright, actually claimed to still possess this cup. So what he actually did, because he had no children to hand it on to, he was the last of the line, he decided to hide it and leave an elaborate set of clues as to where it was. One of these clues being a stained glass window that he had made and paid to have it installed in his local parish church. And basically, those clues had been left there right the way until today. And back in the early 1990s, I decoded this window message, if you like, and it led to a statue in some caves not far away at a place called Hawkstone Park, where there was a statue of an eagle, and that's what the clues were leading to. But what was astonishing and disappointing initially was that I discovered that somebody in the 1920s had tried to move this statue. It had fallen over and broke open, and in the base of it, people had found a small green stone cup. Now, I thought, what? I've followed these clues, and now I find that somebody in the 1920s has accidentally found this thing. The guy's name was Walter Langham. I managed to trace his great-granddaughter, and remarkably, she still had it up in their attic, wrapped up in old newspaper. They didn't know what it was. They just thought it was some interesting curiosity because it had been inside the base of this statue. They had no idea why it was there. I asked if I could borrow it and take it to the British Museum to see if they could tell me what it was. And the first thing they said is, it looks like a Roman-style scent jar of the 1st century AD, which is exactly the time and it's exactly the same item as the original Grail cup was supposed to be. It originally would have had a top to it. It hasn't now. It just looks like a thick kind of green stone egg cup. But what's fascinating about it is that the stone it is made from is green alabaster. And according to the Bible, Mary Magdalene's small scent container is made from green alabaster. So I don't know. Is it a genuine item? It seems to date from the right time. It's certainly, in my opinion, the cup that actually started the whole story of the Holy Grail in the Middle Ages.
And who's in possession of it now, sir?
Well, I ended up in possession of it because the people who actually owned it, you said yourself that it started a real controversy. When it was found, it was 91 or 92, at least when the people who had it, suddenly I was able to tell them what they might have. There was massive interest by the press and media, and they were swamped with people all the time. And because they were religious, shall I say, but not Catholics, they didn't like all this idea of being thought to possess the Grail cup. They just said to me, look, we don't want to have all these journalists coming around here. We think the whole thing is nonsense. You can have the thing. So basically, I was just left with this Grail cup that nobody wanted, which is astonishing. I then, the next thing that happens is that the story becomes big in all throughout, but the response throughout the world, at least in the Catholic world, is that various churches, monasteries, abbeys are all coming forward and saying, no, this guy in England hasn't got the real Grail. We've got it here, and we've got it here. There was places in Mexico that claimed to have it, in Eastern Europe, in Italy. And one of the newspapers in Italy decided to go to the Vatican to get their comment on this, to say, well, you know, which one of these is the real Grail? And they said that the Pope himself was going to look at these claims, read this book of mine, and then on the Friday afternoon, he was going to appear above St. Peter's Square on his balcony and basically tell people which the real Grail was. I thought, how's he going to do this in a week? But anyway, at the end of the week, there he was. Apparently he comes out and makes announcements, or used to anyway, does a sermon or something on Friday afternoon. And anyway, he came out, and what he said was, none of these are the real Grail because we've got it in the Vatican. And I thought, hold on, that's the first time the Vatican has ever claimed to possess a Grail of any type. And of course, they never produced any evidence for this. But when I made a fuss about this and said, look, you know, you've got to come forward and, you know, show us what your Grail is, because if the Grail you've got is thought to have been the cup of the Last Supper, we're talking about a different item altogether. But when I made all this fuss, I suddenly got a call from some newspaper in Italy that was asking for my comment. They said, you do realize you've now been excommunicated? I said, excommunicated? I'm not even communicated. I don't go to church. I'm not a Catholic. How can you excommunicate me? And they said, oh, they've probably done it just in case. So that's the story of the Holy Grail in a nutshell.
That's pretty amazing. So let me ask you this. When you publish a book with this kind of information, I mean, who is it that contacts you first? Was it the media? Was it the church? I mean, how did that go down?
Oh, wow. It was, I mean, what happened first is it was the media that began to call. I didn't think the book was going to sell that many, to be quite honest, when it first came out. And then suddenly, the phone didn't stop ringing. And I mean, I even got interviewed by Newsweek, for goodness sake. And there was an item in Newsweek. I just thought I'd get some publicity in this country. There was massive publicity in Catholic countries. So then the church started to get involved. But it was just, it was quite, one of the weirdest things was the Italians took the most interest in it, of course, I think, because of the whole, the Vatican being in Rome. And there was some Italian national news channel that sent one of their reporters over. Well, in fact, like their kind of anchormen or something like this, like a whole team of them, turned up to see me and interview me. And I thought, oh, wow. And now I lived at that time. I was pretty much a struggling author. And I literally lived in a very small, kind of falling to bits flat. An apartment, a very small, dingy apartment. And I thought, oh God, I can't meet them in this place. It smells. I've got all my, half-eaten TV dinners all over the place. So I wanted to meet them, in a bar or a hotel somewhere. But no, they turned up at the door. And when they came in, one of the producers, the lady there, she came in and she just looked at my flat, and there was this, looked around at the apartment, and there was this look that I thought was a horror on her face. And she just stared at me and she says, oh my goodness, this is just how Jesus would have lived. I said, what? She thought I was choosing to live in this squalid thing because I was a saintly individual. No. So there you go.
So under what capacity did the Catholic Church invite themselves to meet you, or how did that work?
They didn't. They just excommunicated me.
So that was it. That's all you had heard from the Catholic Church.
Apparently, the way it works is every so often, if a book comes out that the Catholic Church do not want to see in Catholic school libraries and stuff like this, it's a banned book, they have to, based on some kind of old ecclesiastical rule, they have to actually excommunicate the author, like they did with Galileo. But how can they check to make sure that somebody's a Catholic? I mean, it's going to take forever. So anybody whose book appears on this list gets excommunicated. So to make sure my book didn't turn up in Catholic schools, I suppose every month they just sort of like, blanket sort of excommunicate a couple of hundred people or something that they don't happen to like. So I don't think they but the Pope did specifically comment on my book. So that was something, I suppose. I mean, not everybody who gets to be basically thrown out of the church by the Pope.
I think that's probably the best press that you could have ever gotten from that book, was to have the Pope almost endorse it.
It was. So, So that cup, I mean, it's nothing weird happened around it. I don't keep it in the house or anything. It's in a bank vault. It just comes out if anyone wants to film it or whatever. But I mean, when I've had TV crews come around, some of them think it's wonderful. Some of them will say, well, this just looks a bit too simple to be something that's a Grail. I thought it was supposed to have gold jewels in it and stuff like this. And I always point to that thing in the Indiana Jones film where there's all those grails, he's got to choose the right one. And he said, this is the cup of a carpenter. Well, in my case, it isn't a cup of a carpenter. It's a scent jar belonging to a poor woman from Jerusalem. Or maybe it was some kind of medieval fake. But if the people in the medieval period, Crusader knights, for example, who lived at the White Castle in the White Town, decided that, we're going to fake a Grail, well, they obviously went off to the Middle East and just so happened to pick up something which is of exactly the right age and seems to come from the right location, because when the British Museum examined it, they actually were able to determine where the kind of alabaster it's made from does originate in Palestine. So I don't know. It's never done anything, but I'm not saying it really does have any powers. But what I am convinced about is that it was the cup that started the story of the Grail in the Middle Ages, if nothing else.
And I think you're right. There are a few known Holy Grails on record throughout the world. And yes, there is one in Mexico, I know. And do you know, has anyone ever written a hierarchy of probable existing Grails based on their provenance?
There's a website somewhere that's got, Layman's Guide to Grails, I think. Mine's in there. They've got loads of them. I mean, but most of the other Grails, none of the other ones are claiming to be or have any association with the Mary Magdalene scent jar. But if you look at any painting of Mary Magdalene done from the Middle Ages onwards, and even earlier, she's always depicted holding this, what they call the alabaster jar, which was the cup that she's associated with, that she is supposed to have used the scent to wash Jesus' feet when she was at a wedding in Cana, as the Bible tells us. And it's also the same cup that she's often depicted in paintings as taking to the tomb where Jesus rises on the third day. So she's always depicted with this chalice in various ways. It's often called the Chalice of Magdalene, which is the title of my book. That's when it came out in America. They called it the Chalice of Magdalene. It's originally called The Search for the Grail, but I don't think they like that title. But none of these other Grails that are anywhere in the world are claiming to be the cup of Mary Magdalene. They're all the Jesus cup from the Last Supper, or in some cases stones, because one of the early Arthurian romances has the Grail as being a magic green stone. Another one from France has the Grail being some sort of plate. So even back then, there was arguments about what the Grail was. And now, of course, you've got the Da Vinci Code added onto all this, so that the Grail happens to be symbolic of the bloodline of Jesus. So it gets more confusing over the years.
I know hindsight is 20/20, and when you read the book, it all makes sense, and there's a definite provenance of what you went through to find that. But how does one get a lead on the Holy Grail? Where did that begin, and what were your first couple of clues that you followed initially?
Well, I'd done the research into the book, one of my first books, King Arthur, The True Story, which is basically looking into the Arthurian legend. So I came from it from the point of view of the King Arthur legend, whereas other people who've done research into the Grail tend to come, they look at it from the point of view of, from the Christian history point of view, rather than the Arthurian legend. So they look at the earliest Christian stories and mythology that arose around the early Christian church to see where the Grail might be mentioned. And a lot of people tend to look at French medieval myths and legends. But what I was doing was simply investigating the King Arthur legend, which of course is set in Britain. And then by researching the King Arthur legend, I came across this white castle in the White Town. And I thought, hold on a minute, this is where they set the Grail story. And then basically just went to the county records for that area and looked through the records to see who was living at that place at that time and what did, anything about them, and couldn't believe it when I found a whole, it's saying that they claim to have possessed the Holy Grail, this cup of Mary Magdalene. I'm thinking, hold on a minute, no one's even noticed this. It's there, right in front of us. The place that we're told, the Grail Chapel where the Grail is hidden, well, when you go there, you find that people at the very time those stories are written claim to have had it. But what I find really fascinating is that their descendant has left all this trail of clues. I mean, I only just very briefly touched upon what the clues were like. But I mentioned about being a stained glass window. What's fascinating is when the fourth Indiana Jones film was made, so they'd got like 4 different types of things he'd gone searching for: the Ark, the Grail, some stones in India, and there was a crystal skull. So Lucasfilms wanted to make an extra for the DVD box set of all 4 films. They also had an additional disc with a documentary in it about people who had really looked for the Ark of the Covenant and the other things that Indiana Jones had done. And for the Grail, they chose my thing. And so when they interviewed me, when the documentary came out on the disc, and I was watching it, there's me saying, and then I found a stained glass window. Then I see that Indiana Jones, and because I'd seen the film, it never occurred to me. There he is, looking at his clues in a stained glass window. I'm thinking, oh my God. And it was actually Lucasfilms that described me as a real life Indiana Jones. That wasn't something I just sort of made up out of nowhere. I thought, well, if Lucasfilms calls me a real life Indiana Jones, I am one.
Yeah, I'd be one too. I want to be a real life Indiana Jones. I don't know how we're going to shift gears here, but let's shift gears. I want to talk about your latest book, and it's called Wisdom Keepers of Stonehenge. And I'd like you to describe the premise of the book, because there's so many theories of Stonehenge as there are stones. So tell me, please, sir, what is Stonehenge?
Okay, well, Stonehenge is in central southern England. And the monument we see today with its arches all around it, some of them have fallen over the years, is about 5,000 years old. In fact, the structure we see now is actually about 4,500 years old. But the very first stones of Stonehenge were put into place around 5,000 years ago. But it may be the most famous stone circle in Britain, but it is just one of thousands that once existed. I mean, it's been estimated that there were probably at least 5,000 of them, of which well over 1,000 still survive in various states of preservation. And they're all over the country. They're over Ireland, Scotland, England, Wales, all over the British Isles. And these stone circles were being used and being maintained for about, now it's realized, about 3,000 years, all in all. And the people who built the first ones were basically Stone Age people, Neolithic people. They were using simple tools such as animal antlers for picks, bones for shovels and stone axes. And they were cutting and shaping these stones into stone circles all over the place. And Stonehenge, as I say, may be the most famous, and it's the only one that has those arches going around it. It is far from the biggest. Stonehenge is about 100 feet in diameter. There's another stone circle about 20 miles due north of Stonehenge called the Avebury Stone Circle. That was made up of around about 100 stones, some weighing up to 50 tons, and it is 1,000 feet in diameter. If you walk all around the outside of it in circumference, it's half a mile. And there were many other very large stone circles that in size-wise put Stonehenge to shame. So it's an entire culture of stone circle building that only happened in Britain. There are other megalithic or early stone monuments to be found in other parts of Europe, standing stones or rows of stones, but stone circles like Stonehenge are unique to the British Isles.
Why is this one such a mystery?
Well, the thing is that it's why people would spend so much time building these structures. The first mystery is that during the period that these stone circles were built and used, there was about 5 different migrations of people into the British Isles across from continental Europe, from what's now the Netherlands, Belgium, Germany. And these people had very different practices of their own. They had different burial practices. We can tell they followed different religions because they left different sorts of grave goods in their tombs. So these people came to Britain, yet even though they had different cultural or religious backgrounds, they all seem to have joined in from the archaeological evidence with the stone circle building and stone circle use throughout this entire period. So it would seem to suggest that whatever these stone circles were built for had some kind of practical purpose rather than just a religious function like a church or a temple. And over recent years, archaeologists have determined that many stone circles, well, all of them really, from as far as we can tell, because remember, a lot of them have got stones that have fallen down and been smashed up to make way so that people can use it for rubble to build buildings and so forth. But from what we can tell, stone circles have as viewed from the center of the circle, there are certain stones strategically placed to mark out where the sunrise or sunset is at very specific times of the year, like the midwinter or midwinter solstice. But that's not all. It's stones also align with the rising and setting of particularly bright stars and to the positions of the moon. So over recent years, the idea has come about in academic circles that Stonehenge and other stone circles were built as some kind of astronomical calculator. In other words, they could calculate very certain times of the year. And the idea is that they may have done this so that they knew when to sow, tend, reap crops. But you wouldn't need a stone circle to determine just when to plant crops and so forth. I mean, other people are doing it elsewhere in the world without the use of stone circles. Where you would need something like a stone circle to make precise sightings of where certain stars are, so you can get very precise timings of day and night throughout the year. The only reason that if stone circles were built as astronomical calculators, they must have been built to enable some very precise calculations indeed.
So you say that that those actual stone circles are unique to Britain, and as you know, Britain is not civilization in Britain isn't some of the oldest cultures on the planet. So we don't find those, say, in Central Asia. Nothing similar.
The only other stone circle, there's Göbekli Tepe stone circle. It's not really a stone circle. It's like stone circular temple things, but they were built much earlier. But of single, just standing stones in circles, they are unique to Britain.
So what do archaeologists and historians believe was the purpose? How many different uses have you come up with or researched that were proposed by other archaeologists or historians?
Well, the problem was that up until 2,000 years ago, there was no form of writing in Britain. Nobody had developed any form of writing, so there are no written records. It is genuinely prehistoric times until the Romans turned up about 2,000 years ago and brought writing with them. So you've got the whole period, this megalithic period when they're building these stone circles, when there is no form of writing in this country. So how to figure out what the stone circles are used for, basically it was firstly the question is, okay, let's find out who was using them. Who were the people who actually used these stone circles? Now, the answer to that has been there really all the time, but it's only because of the latest scientific methods that are able to be used by archaeologists to determine the contents of tombs and put precise aging on them that we can now get some better idea about the people who were using them. What's fascinating is that built often very close to or even adjacent to stone circles are a certain type of unique tomb called a box tomb. Now, other people who came to Britain were buried in all sorts of different ways. Some people buried and they had mounds put over them. Other people, other cultures came along and they cremated their dead and buried them in urns in the ground, and all sorts of different burial practices took place. But one consistent type of burial throughout the whole of this megalithic period is these so-called box tombs that are placed next to stone circles. They're about, on average, about 18 foot long, about 8 foot wide. They're made of stone slabs, if you like standing stones, but placed on their sides to create a kind of rectangular box. And then they have capstones placed over them, and then they'd have been covered by a mound. And they had an opening to one end so that they can have multiple burials. And the burials are placed at one end of these box tombs, and at the other end is the grave goods, which, generally speaking, if most cultures are anything to go by, the grave goods that are put in a tomb with the occupant is usually something to do with what they did in life. I mean, if they're a warrior, it would be their sword or their armor or whatever. What's interesting is in these box tombs, there have been very good condition pots found that still contain these substances that were in them when they were sealed up. And what's fascinating is that scientific analysis of the pottery that was buried with these people, that presumably would be officiating at whatever happened at stone circles, because they're the only ones who are buried anywhere near them. When these pots have been analyzed, they've been found to contain plant extracts that could only have been used for pharmaceutical purposes, for anti-inflammatory purposes, for pain relief, decongestant, for getting rid of parasites. And in other words, the people who were building the stone circles and using them seem to have been healers. And they seem to have been able to make some pretty spectacular medicines for the time. And what's fascinating is this then starts to explain why they may have needed to have such precise calculations necessary for stone circles to be built. Because, for example, there are certain flowers give off particular chemicals at very specific times of the year and on certain nights when the moon is in a certain position in order to attract pollinating moths. And if you get that particular extract from the flower, then it can be used at that time for a medicinal purpose. Get it at the wrong time, you'll end up killing yourself. Now, many extracts from plants necessary for being used for pharmaceutical purposes have to be extracted at very specific times of the year, and sometimes, as I say, at very specific times of the day and night. And this is what I believe that the stone circles were built for.
So would you suggest that the location that was picked out for these stone circles was also a location that would have been advantageous for growing herbs and other types of medicines that they would have used then?
Absolutely. That seems to have been the case. And there are two things they're bearing in mind. One, they need to have a good view of the skies. And back then, it was actually a lot warmer climate in Britain than it is now. They would have had much clearer skies than we get these days. I mean, most of the time now it rains in this country, but it wasn't like that back then. So the clear view of the skies and the kind of land that could grow the kind of things that they were hoping to extract these substances from. But what I find fascinating now is that until relatively recently, it was always thought that the megalithic culture had died out by about 700 BC when the Celtic people arrived in Britain from Germany. And therefore, by the time the Romans arrived and they started writing about what the Britons did, well, people would say this has got nothing to do with stone circle builders because they're a new bunch of people. But this latest dating of box tombs has shown a continuity all the way through, right the way until the Romans invaded. And so the Celts were just another group of people who had come to Britain, and although they changed the culture a lot in this country, they still seem to have been venerating these places, the stone circles, the latest dating shows they were still being repaired and maintained, and that same box tombs with the same type of burials in them, with the same herbs and other medicinal substances buried in them. That was happening right the way through until the Romans arrived. So all we need to know now is, in Roman writings, what do they say about the people who were buried in these box tombs? Well, they called them the Druids. And it was long thought that the Druids basically had nothing to do with whoever built stone circles. They'd just used them when they turned up for some religious practices. Whereas in reality, at the very least now, we know that the Druids are the direct successors of those who were building the stone circles, and what they were using them for. The Druids were still using them for that purpose. And what do the Romans tell us? They tell us that they were accomplished healers. Julius Caesar, one of the writers who writes about the Druids, tells us how he is completely, gobsmacked, basically, as to how they know so much about natural cures, even more than the Romans knew. And Roman writers refer to them as knowing how to collect substances at very specific times of the year. And it seems they were doing this by using stone circles. So it's not just the archaeology now that tells us that these people were healers and they were using the stone circles as a way of calculating how to make these substances. It's not just the archaeology. We even know it from the history books the Romans left behind. And what's fascinating is one particular writer, a man called Pliny the Elder, writing about 60 AD, actually tells us that the Druids even had a cure for cancer, or at least some kind of cancers, obtained from mistletoe. And what's astonishing is that today, scientists have developed forms of chemotherapy based on this exact same substance from mistletoe that the Druids were using.
What do we know about the Druids? The history behind them and who they were, do we only know who they were because of the Romans?
Pretty much, yes, Roman and Greek writing. But the problem was that, as Julius Caesar said, he met Druids in France, in what they called Gaul then, but he quite clearly states that they were based in Britain. And the Romans started to invade Britain in 43 AD. In 60 AD, there was a revolt led by Queen Boudica. That's quite a famous revolt. And they almost succeeded in overthrowing the Romans in Britain, but they just failed. At this point, the Emperor Nero, who was pretty loony, really, he decided that it was the Druids who were holding the British tribes together. It was them that he blamed for the revolt against Rome, and he didn't like them at all. And he ordered the soldiers in Britain to exterminate the Druids. So they basically rounded them all up onto an island off the west coast of Britain, a place called Anglesey. And there are graphic accounts by Roman historians, one particular one by a man called Tacitus, in which he describes how these Druids, which were men, women, and children trained to be Druids as well, he had them all wiped out. But before they were wiped out by the Romans, we're not only told that they were healers, but that they lived in communities outside normal society. They didn't live in the normal settlements. They lived in what I suppose you could describe them as simple monasteries, except there were both men and women as Druids. So it wasn't just an all male or all female thing. They had men and women who were Druids. They were trained from being children from a very early age in astonishing memory techniques. They were using mnemonic techniques like visualization, such as certain mental issues to impress people with tricks by remembering dozens of packs of cards, one after the other, with haven't seen them just once, or they even the Romans tell us that they use something which only today I think be described as hypnosis to help people recall great amounts of detail. And because they had no form of writing, the Druids were basically the living libraries of the pre-Roman cultures. They were living in these communities. Not only did they know all about the different plants that they were supposed to be using in the various times to collect and prepare these medicines, they also were the keepers of the culture of the people of Britain. They remembered the history. They remembered all sorts of other things that were important, like tool making and so forth. So not only were the Druids the stone circle users, but they were also the libraries, the living libraries of megalithic culture.
Exactly. So I'm just wondering why, because they were living libraries, why wasn't that important to the Romans in keeping them and learning from them? Because basically the Romans were there to seek power and property and wealth. So why wouldn't that be part of it?
Well, you can tell by the different types of writing of the Romans and the Greeks. There was Romans who came to Britain, and there was Greeks. And the Greeks who encountered the Romans, Greeks who encountered the Druids, write favorably about them. They tell us the kind of things I've been talking about. The Romans, on the other hand, as a kind of militaristic force, the Romans had a completely different way of looking at things too. What they really couldn't stand about the Britons they encountered when they came here was that they had equal rights for men and women. They just couldn't understand that. That was just an abomination to the Romans. The Romans, in the arena in Rome, if you were a woman, you had to sit at the very back, even further away from the action than slaves. And then take a culture like the Romans, who actually glorified killing in arenas the way that they did, whereas somebody like the Greeks, for example, were more into sports and wrestling and the Olympic Games started. The Romans were a militaristic bunch of people who cared nothing about other people's cultures if it happened to get in the way of what they wanted to do. And they had a system of an all-powerful emperor. And if the all-powerful emperor at the time happened to have been a madman, as Nero clearly was, he burnt down half of Rome just so he could build himself a new palace. He was eventually overthrown by his own generals because he was such a loon. He was the one that ordered all the Druids wiped out. There's other Roman emperors that the Emperor Vespasian, that came shortly after Nero, ordered the death of millions of Jews in Palestine. I mean, millions of Jewish people were killed by him. It was an early Holocaust that had taken place under the Emperor Vespasian's orders after a revolt against Roman rule. If people revolted against Roman rule that had already been conquered, then the general idea was they were made to pay. And Nero considered that the Druids were the ones who were holding British culture together and able to oppose him. And in some ways, he was probably right. So that's why. But as I say, the difference between the Greek writers tell us, write about them and say, wow, these people had some amazing medicines. These people were extremely wise. But the Romans tell us that they slaughtered babies, that they sacrificed people, that they were cannibals. I mean, there's no archaeological evidence for that whatsoever. So that kind of like explains the Romans. I'm not too keen on them, really, myself.
Oxford University, they've studied the archaeology of Stonehenge and they put a date but there are archaeologists who say that the Druids only go back about 2,400 years. So what's the disparity there? To me, I wouldn't believe that all of a sudden the Druids just showed up 2,400 years ago. Is there an explanation who by others existed prior to the Druids and where the Druids came from?
The Druids are considered to be a purely Celtic priesthood, because that's what the Romans thought they were. And the Celts first arrived in Britain about 700 BC. That's the Iron Age Celt. And by the time the Romans turned up, the Druids had been adopted as their kind of priesthood, if you like. But that was the thinking, but the latest archaeological dating of box tombs showing that the people who were buried in box tombs were being buried in exactly the same way all the way back for 3,000 years before the Romans turned up, are one and the same people who had been using Stonehenge and the stone circles. And we know that the Romans referred to these people buried in box tombs as Druids. So that proves now, the latest archaeology, that the Druids were here for a lot longer than has previously been thought. And you're absolutely right. They didn't just suddenly sort of turn up and they'd been here for ages. It was just that the Druids were the Celtic incarnation of them, if you like. They'd probably changed a bit, but they were still the same, doing the same things and being the same people as they were before. I mean, as I said, there'd been about 5 separate migrations of people into Britain over those 3,000 years, and these box tombs continued to be used. Therefore, they must have been the people who were officiating at the stone circles, hence the Druids, if you get what I mean.
Mm-hmm. So you talk about how these megaliths of stone circles, they were aligned to the position of the sun, the moon, the stars at certain times of the year. How is that important, and has any of those positions been decoded as to the possibility of how that system worked?
Yeah, it's a bit, I mean, I tried to explain this in the book, exactly how it worked, and I found I went into 2 chapters of it trying to explain the mathematics of the whole thing, and my publishers just said, oh, forget it. I was so confused myself at the end of it. But simply put, when you go to a stone circle that is fairly well intact, you can stand in the middle of it on the midwinter solstice, the shortest day of the year, and you will see the sun going down behind a prominent stone. These stone circles, except that the outer ones are Stonehenge, it's a bit different, but most of the stone circles, if it's just a single circle of stones, they're not equally spaced. They're you might get sort of 6 feet between 2 stones and only 3 feet between the next one. They're deliberately awkward. And like Stonehenge has got other stones, or did have originally, placed outside it, and it's got an arrangement of stones that you can line up to. The sun rising at particularly important times like midsummer, midwinter, and the equinoxes, and particularly bright stars and recognizable constellations when they first start to appear in the skies at certain time of summer. Those you will find as a stone that's directly in line with where that star was. You have to make some calculations about this because the stars are in a slightly different position to what they used to be in the past because the Earth kind of wobbles on its axis. So you have to work out all this stuff mathematically, but there's been plenty of work done into it. There can be no doubt anymore that they were calculated.
So have any of the Druid medical knowledge been basically translated to modern times? Is there any of that evidence that they had found in clay pottery that we've been able to reproduce or get a really, really good idea of what that actually was?
No one's actually, at the moment, gone round and said, right, let's try and see if I can eat that and see if that works. But I'll give one example. There's something that used to grow in Britain that doesn't anymore because the climate's colder, and that's called the thorn apple, or the Jimson weed as it's known in America. It still grows in California and certain places in Europe. It doesn't grow here anymore. But the thorn apple itself, the fruit of the Jimson weed, is something that was discovered in these pots. Now, if you just took a bite out of one, you'd be dead. It's poisonous, deadly poisonous. If you take so much of it, it can kind of send you as high as a kite. But if you want to use it for some medical purpose, and the purpose being We know this because, again, this is something that the Greek writers have told us about the Druids, that they did use these thorn apples to create a general anesthetic. They actually were able to extract substances from the thorn apple, and that can only be done at very specific times of the year to be suitable to knock you out without killing you. And it is believed that that was probably used for amputations and other painful surgery like stitching up wounds, because in the tombs, not only have they found pottery containing these medicinal substances, but also scalpels and saws that seem to have been used in surgery and needles for sewing up wounds. So they actually were able to create a general anesthetic centuries, millennia before anybody really came up with a useful general anesthetic in the form of chloroform in the 19th century. The Romans were not very good at anesthetics. They just got people drunk, and that was the way. That was the way of chopping people's arms off right the way and through until the 19th century. And that just, I mean, if you're going to drink yourself into such a stupor that you're not going to feel your arm being cut off, the chances are you might probably die. So it seems that the ancients had a form of general anesthetic that wasn't rediscovered again until the 19th century.
That would be the ultimate hangover, to drink all night and then wake up and be missing an arm or a leg. That would be, I can't even think of anything that bad. I'll never complain again. So was
that's
it?
What that's.
Go ahead.
Bite on this, and here's a couple of shots of rum or something. Yeah.
So was the fate and elimination of the Druids solely in the hands of the Romans?
Yeah, they got rid of them in Britain pretty conclusively, but some of them did manage to get over to Ireland. In Ireland, the Druids kept going until the 400s, but we don't know too much about that because they weren't really writing down what they were doing. So it's still mysterious, but surviving in Irish mythology, there are hints about what the Druids did, but it's more because it's been mythologized over the years, tends to make the Druids more into the idea of Gandalf-like wizards or Merlin figures, these sort of people. But they survived in Ireland until the Christian church started to take hold in Ireland in a big way in the 400s. And the early Christian missionaries were converting the tribal chieftains, and at this point, the tribal chieftains turned on the Druids, and that was pretty much the end of them over there. You have modern Druids today that still meet at Stonehenge on Midsummer's Day, but they really only started in the 19th century. People had read that Druids had been healers, and that Druids had some kind of let's say the legends of the Druids were that they had magical powers. That's the way that the Irish myths and legends portrayed them. And people in the 19th century became very romantic about the past, and new orders of Druids were formed. And those that are there now are basically the descendants of them, having no real connection at all with the Druids that were really here when the Romans arrived.
What's the largest stone circle in Britain?
The largest is the Avebury Stone Circle, which is about 20 miles north of Stonehenge. And as I said, that's 1,000 feet in diameter, consisted of about 100 stones up to 50 tons in weight. It's not only that, it's a complete complex of monuments, some of which are completely beyond me. I can't understand what they were used for. All around Avebury, there is a ditch about 30 feet deep and 30 feet wide, and an embankment 30 feet high and thick all around the outside. That would have taken even more work and effort and time to build than the stones themselves being put into place. This is this great circular ditch and embankment. Now, some people said, oh, it was used for defensive. That people would have wanted to defend their own settlements inside the stone circles. Well, Avebury didn't have any settlement inside the stone circle going back in the past. It's so big now that a modern village has grown up inside it. But the weird thing about these embankments and ditches is if they were supposed to be defensive, you would have the ditch on the outside of the embankment. That's the way defenses work. But the ditch on the inside of the embankment is just nuts. It's not built for defensive purposes. And it is these ditches and embankments around the outside of stone circles, the larger ones, that are known as henges, from where the name Stonehenge comes from. Because there's one of these around Stonehenge as well that a lot of people aren't aware of. So with Avebury, you've not only got the massive stone circle, you've got this henge construction around it. You've then got other rings of stone inside that. And then either side of it, you've got these great long avenues of stones, 6 to 8 foot high, spaced about 50 feet apart, double rows of stones going for 2 or 3 miles. And then in between these two avenues of stones, you've got an even more weird structure, which is an artificial hill, huge. It's about 300 feet high and covers about 5 or 6 acres. And archaeological excavations and geophysics surveys have shown that there was nothing buried inside them. There was no burial chambers, no chambers of any kind, no skeletons. It was just an artificial hill. And a lot of these megalithic complexes, as they're called, big stone circles, bigger than Stonehenge, have got these hills built near them. And what they were for is still a mystery.
Your work is very impressive, and most of your books are available on Amazon.com, and just looking at them and the amount of work and that you've put in years and years of research is amazing. So how do you top this? What are you coming up with next?
Well, I'm thinking of doing a book about Pandora's box. It's supposed to have been the vessel that was opened by Pandora and released all the evils on the world. So if I find it, I'm not going to open it. But it fascinates me, this one. It's where the idea of this Pandora's box come from. Was it a real item that people thought had whatever power that this box had? So I might do that.
My guest tonight has been one of Britain's best-selling nonfiction authors. Thank you so much, Graham Phillips, for being my guest tonight. And I'd like to give you the final word, sir.
Well, if you want to look me up, it's grahamphillips.net. That is my website, and you'll see everything all about my books there, pages and pages of everything you want to know, plus films I've made. grahamphillips.net.
Beautiful website. Sir, thank you for joining me tonight. It's been a great pleasure. It's super, super interesting, and I'd like to have you back someday, and we'll talk about other works that you've done. And again, thank you very much.
Marvelous. Thank you.
My Alien Life Podcast.
You can find my website at www.myalienlifepodcast.com, and please subscribe to my latest downloads at iTunes, Spotify, Stitcher, and at podbean.com. And please follow me and like me on Facebook and Twitter. My Alien Life is written and produced for broadcast at Studio 254 in the Northern Rocky Mountains. The music you are hearing is produced and created by Elion. You can find all Elion's work online at Heart Dance Records.